Welcome to Unit 4, The Age of Empires, or The Height of European Imperialism, as your textbook refers to it. This is a time period that goes from about 1800, kind of towards the tail end of the American Revolution, really as the Industrial Revolution starts kicking off, into about 1914, arguably, I would say probably until the 1940s, more realistically. But the content of the chapter is just about before World War One, because colonies are very different after that war. So I thought pick this image as kind of the first one in the presentation because I thought it's pretty appropriate. You've got a goddess of liberty, Greek clearly inspired. She's wearing the cap of wisdom on top of it. And it's supposed to show, basically this is what European civilization or Western civilization likes to laud itself for. Freedom, liberty, equality, wisdom, art and perfection, etc., etc. Good stuff. But in the background, the broken chains on the Statue of European Liberty are on a African woman in the background, with chains on her wrists, or Asian in this, or really anywhere in the world except for Europe, American. This is, I think, a pretty telling map and chart about the British Empire, kind of showing the total inequality of the imperial system. The areas in pink, you can just kind of subtract. Let me get my little pointer going. You can subtract the 13 colonies in a sense, but in a lot of ways, the U.S. still was part of the British or English-speaking Anglosphere. So, in any case, 10% of the British Empire's population benefited from the labor and lives of 90% of the British Empire. And 70% of that empire was in British India, which you can see was called the crown jewel of the British Empire. So effectively, what imperialism is a wealth transfer from areas of the world that were colonized to areas of the world that were colonizing. In short, Europe took the riches and the lives and the labor of people in the rest of the world and made themselves wealthier than they had ever been in their history. There were some benefits. This is a Indian Railways train, and gosh, I think 2015. It's electrified, low carbon. If India didn't have this railway system built by the British, climate change would be accelerated dramatically. There's been many papers on this. So there were some benefits of imperialism, sort of. This wasn't really a choice to build a railway system across the Indian subcontinent. But now India is a country that has public transit between various cities of millions. So the first section of this unit, kind of after that introduction, is about colonial rule in Southeast Asia. So when you think back to perhaps Mr. Wald's class, or if you've taken world history somewhere else, World History 1 rather, this is basically the Colombian attempt to find spices in Asia. Southeast Asia is the Indies, the East Indies, as they ended up being referred when, you get the West Indies and the modern day Caribbean in North America. So again, this is the land of spices and gold and tremendous wealth. This is the European empires have been trying to find this ever since the Turks, the Muslim Turks, took over the Middle East and kept European traders from trading with China and Southeast Asia. A new imperialism occurs in the late 19th century, and this changes the relationship between European empires and Asian peoples. In short, your focus questions answer is going to be basically industrialization made it easier to exploit people, and that made it so rule of Asia by Europeans accelerated. This is a super creepy picture of Great Britain as a grasping octopus man. And I think that's appropriate. So there's a never ending desire to acquire more territories. You see a hand on India, you see a hand reaching for Egypt, Malta. I can't read what it says in the back, but it's, Boersland. So that's South Africa. Cape Colony you see as well. Ireland, I think, is under the arm. Scotland is under the other arm. So in any case, the old pattern of imperialism was that of resources being traded in Southeast Asia. In North America, if you remember from the US 1 class, you had a relationship called mercantilism, where basically you had the US colony, or I'm sorry, the 13 colonies, and buying goods from the mother country, and the mother country in exchange would send those countries raw materials. The biggest difference with new imperialism is effectively it became easier to imperialize around the rest of the world than it was in the colonial era in the United States, for example. So there are basically four different motivators or kind of definitions that give you a sense of what's new about the new imperialism. And so this would be great stuff for your focus question. The first one is an economic need for raw materials requires control to extract them. So, think about colonial America. You send some folks out in the folks go out in the woods, they kill some beavers, they send some pelts back to Great Britain. Easy peasy. No need of control. You are mining diamonds. You don't want just people willy nilly, if you're an empire, pulling diamonds out of the ground, so you strictly control it. Military guards, etc. Expensive, more detailed control. Other countries, big octopus hands like Great Britain here. Everyone wants to be this creepy, horrible octopus. So, hey, Britain's got a bunch of colonies. I'm France, or I'm the president of France. I want to have a bunch of colonies. So it's kind of a keeping up with the Joneses mentality. And that accelerates as more colonies get extracted from the world. Social Darwinism, which is racism, the idea that if a person is a country is able to be conquered by an imperial power, they must be inferior, or else why would they not be the ones conquering? Helps justify the new imperialism. And then there's this twist on social Darwinism, which is supposed to look benevolent, which is called white man's burden to civilize the world and all the savages, half devil, half child. I think is what the poem refers to the people of Africa as being. So still racism, but it's like, but we're being nice and we're trying to help you. So in Southeast Asia, the first group that was really, really heavily involved were the Dutch. And then the Spanish, roughly around the same time, came into the Philippines. The Dutch basically came into those East Indies, again, the Spice Islands. So the orange here, modern day Indonesia, one of the tons and tons of resources. But over time, countries like Great Britain, freed from its colonial wars in the Americas, start expanding into Southeast Asia. The island of Singapore, I cannot overemphasize the importance of. Let me get my pointer out. It's at the tip right here of the Malaya Peninsula, or Malay Peninsula, I'm sorry. And it is effectively the same thing as the Fortress of Gibraltar at the gates of the Mediterranean Sea. You cannot easily travel from China to India to Europe without passing through the Straits of Malacca, which is where the island of Singapore is. It is kind of the crown jewel of the South China Sea. So the British control this, and they have gatekeeper control basically of Southeast Asia because of this. They also annexed Burma, which has some interesting resistances to them over the centuries, and attempt to invade China. If you know anything about World War II, it's very difficult to travel by land from Burma to China, and so they fail in this attempt. The French, they have missionaries in what is the future countries of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And when the British start coming into Southeast Asia, again, they don't want to be left behind by Great Britain, and they make Indochina into a protectorate to defend it from British influence, while also annexing the Mekong Delta, where the city of oh my gosh, what's the capital? The old capital of Vietnam, off the top of my head right now. Hanoi is the other one. Saigon. So the city of Saigon. All right. So the imperialism of Southeast Asia also had a bit of an exception with the country of Thailand. So Thailand did something similar to what the Japanese did or the Ethiopians in the 20th century, in that they adopted Western technology, military organization in particular, education systems, and in many cases, those education systems learned the language of the imperial powers so they could argue that they were just as civilized to the Europeans as the Europeans. That wouldn't have been enough because imperialism really doesn't care about the will of the people being conquered, but their geography did prevail. And so since Thailand is between Indochina and Burma, which is part of British India, it was seen as a buffer state between the French and the British, so they were able to survive as an independent nation. King Mongkut and Chalulalakaran, they are both absolutely brilliant monarchs. They both spoke English and French. I believe one of them spoke German. I can't remember which one. Mongkut is famous from the play The King and I, and basically his son was able to get a treaty from the British and the French promising to both countries would protect their independence. The United States gets involved with imperialism in East Asia late, and the Spanish American War, the Philippines are conquered by the Pacific Fleet. And President McKinley basically takes a social Darwinistic view, that the U.S. needs to civilize these islands because they're superior to the Spanish. Because otherwise, why would the Spanish lose the war to America? You can also see the other motivation is an economic one. All the finished goods from American factories are being stepstoned, here's the Philippines under Uncle Sam's foot, to China in order to sell those goods. Um, Emilio Equinaldo, the first elected president of the Philippines, started his revolution under Spanish rule and continued it as soon as the American invaders showed up. I live in Greenfield, Massachusetts, and this is a photograph of our current public library, which is actually being replaced, incidentally, which is kind of exciting. But the part that I wanted to show you was the statue in the foreground. So this is a conquering American soldier stepping into the Philippine Islands, and it's a memorial basically to Americans who fought in the Spanish-American War. And I think it's just an interesting statue. You can see how he's striding; his face isn't seen, square jaw, very prideful sort of thing, gun in hand. This is a conquering statue. And so it's just useful to remember that people in the late 19th century were proud of their empire. They were proud of exploiting the resources of the Philippines because they thought that they were superior. And you can see that in the art and the statues that were created in this time. If you ever see a Civil War statue, compare the stance of the soldier in that one. They're usually standing there with a rifle in their hand at ease because the war is over, to the Spanish American War statue in this image, where again the soldier is striding and conquering a foreign nation. This is a time lapse of the Dutch control of the future country of Indonesia. City of Batavia is now the capital of Indonesia. It's got a new name now, which I can't think off the top of my head. But the reason I'm showing this time lapse is so you can see how it accelerates once industrialization occurs. 1800, you start getting industrialized technology quickly. 1860, and so in that 100 years between 1800 and 1942, you get the full Indonesian archipelago annexed by the Dutch because they have the technology to do so. This is a pretty harsh cartoon, and so but it's also accurate. You've got native peoples carrying the national personifications of the various empires. That's what colonialism is about. That's what imperialism is about. There are different ways of going about it. They're known as indirect rule and direct rule. They kind of are what they sound like. In indirect rule, in imperialism, colonies have local rulers, which are kind of co-opted by the imperial authorities. So basically, you might have a king who's still the king once the British or the French or whoever come in. But now they're being paid by the empire to collect taxes and to mine diamonds, for example, or mine gold, or grow sugar on plantations. So the local elites, they speak the language of the native people. They know what motivates them, and they know how to basically police and tax them and keep them under control. This kind of rule was particularly popular when the empires of the Dutch and the British, for example, were run by state chartered companies. So the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company, these are corporations like Exxon or Mobil or Amazon, and they basically have empires that get folded into direct rule when industrialization occurs, and it becomes more important for the country in their eyes to control these territories than letting indirect rule continue. Direct rule basically, again, if the resource is valuable enough, you want to make sure that diamond mine doesn't have anyone sneaking out diamonds from it because you want to make your home country rich. Or in the case of Burma, for example, the king ends up resisting his role as a British puppet and starts to tell the people of his country to resist. So that king is sent to India, where he's put into a beautiful gilded prison, meaning, a palace, but never allowed to return to his home country. And that's when the British assumed direct rule. So this is very similar to Bismarck, Otto von Bismarck of Germany's Realpolitik. Whatever is going to be effective, whatever is going to be practical, is going to be the thing that's done as long as exploitation of foreign people is occurring and their resources. So it's really just about what's going to be the best way to take these other people's stuff if you're a European imperial power. The basis of the colonial economy is extraction of resources. So most of this is set up as in monoculture, meaning one crop, plantations. In Burma, it's teakwood. In Malaysia, it's which is basically Singapore is part of Malaysia. It's kind of the south part of the peninsula, south of Thailand. Rubber and later oil. The Singaporean island itself has millions eventually of Chinese immigrants go there that speak all the local languages and conduct trade that ends up benefiting local elites, but mostly the people in the United Kingdom itself. The Dutch people in the Netherlands benefit from Indonesian people who are harvesting spices, tea, coffee, and palm oil. So the Netherlands is one of the richest countries in the world now. Indonesia is not, but the labor of Indonesians of past generations helped make the Netherlands as rich as it is now. The Philippines, similarly for the United States, was one of the largest sugarcane producers in the world. The Spanish benefited, people in Spain benefited from that, and then Americans did once the Americans took over that colony. Basically, thousands lived and died in abject poverty, but there were some beneficial projects like railroads and hospitals, but those were all built effectively to aid in the extraction of resources. So, at the beginning of the presentation, I showed you the Indian Railways train. Yes, it's there and it helps the people there now, but that was not its purpose. Its purpose was to help extract resources from India. The reason that folks end up resisting imperialism in Southeast Asia is because it's exploitation, plain and simple. Initially, and so again, it's a similar pattern. Those that to indirect versus direct rule, except from the other angle, those that have power are able to resist colonial rule the most effectively. I mentioned the King of Burma. This is a drawing of him being exiled to India from his homeland, and his resistance led to his country's annexation, but it was effective initially. The emperor in Vietnam didn't want heard what happened in Burma, and so didn't push back against the French, but his government did. So you have all sorts of subtle ways that the kind of middle class in Vietnam messes with French rule in that country. Peasants generally more unsuccessful because they don't have machine guns, and the European imperialists do. The ultimately most successful angle of resisting imperialism was educated people at the new universities in these various countries. They literally spoke the language of their oppressors and could argue they deserved nation states just like those in Europe. But it took until the 1930s and the crisis of World War II for these arguments to finally extract promises from the empires. Folks like Mahatma Gandhi, for example, are able to extract from Great Britain a promise to grant India independence as soon as World War II is over, because they're able to, again, articulate that argument in English to the folks that are imperializing them. Basically, resistance to imperialism grows as people get more education and more resources with which to resist.